Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello and welcome to mini episode 363 of Real Life Ghost Stories, and I have 4 spooky stories for you today, and the last story comes from May the 14th, 2024, and story number 1 comes from Carmelo. When I was around 9 years old, I remember waking up early one morning. As I opened my eyes, I was immediately gripped by an intense fear. Standing before me was a bearded man dressed in thick, white corded pyjamas. His arms were stretched out, revealing puncture marks on both wrists. I was terrified. Yet the man looked at me calmly, placed a finger to his lips, and gestured for silence. In my fright, I dove under the covers, my heart pounding violently. I stayed hidden for what felt like an eternity before daring to look again. By then, he had vanished. I rushed to my parents' room to tell them what happened. My mother, a devout Catholic, interpreted the visitation as a sign from Jesus, comforting me with assurance of his protection. Years later, at 15, after we had moved to a new house, my uncle from Sicily, who was like an older brother to me, came to stay with us for medical treatment. He was battling leukemia, and there were better treatment options available here. The first night he stayed, we shared my room. After some light-hearted chatter, we prepared for bed. As he changed into his pyjamas, a wave of recognition hit me. They were identical to the ones worn by the mysterious visitor years later. That same night, I awoke to find my uncle, though asleep in his bed, standing by it and mimicking the same silence gesture the bearded man had used. I was utterly astounded. I shared these eerie similarities with my parents, who, in their concern, called our local priest to bless me and our home. Every room was prayed over in an effort to cleanse it. Tragically, my uncle passed away a few months later. Now, I'm going to bet that that story did not go where you thought it was going to go, because when I first read it, it did not go where I thought it was going to go. We've had a couple of these stories over the years where somebody has seen an apparition or somebody in a dream, and then years later they realise that it is an event that is happening and like playing out before them in real life years later. And also we've gotten stories of people who have the ability to astral project. So just for some behind the scenes content, I just spent an embarrassing amount of time thinking that astral projection was actually called aquaplaning. And then I could not for the life of me remember what the phrase was, because then I realised I don't think it's aquaplaning. I don't think that's what I want to say. And maybe in essence there's multitudinous things happening here. Like maybe it's about astral projection. Clearly this is something your uncle was able to do if you woke up and saw him standing by his bed while he was also in bed. And maybe it's something to do with your connection over time, and that's why you saw him all those years before wearing those same sort of pyjamas that he was wearing all those years later. Like, is it possible that this was some sort of premonition? What a fascinating story. And story number 2 comes from M. When my mother was around 18, she was visiting her grandparents' very old home in the city that they had only recently moved into. She woke up sometime in the night to a shadow-looking thing across the room watching her, that then started moving towards her and had a long cape on with a big axe in its hands. It started hitting the axe against her arm, and she couldn't move and just started praying, hoping it would stop, and then finally fell back to sleep. When she woke up in the morning, her arm was in so much pain, and when she told her grandparents about what happened, they said since moving in, a lot of haunted stuff had happened to them as well. A big shadow figure with an axe is not who I want my sleep paralysis demon to be. That is absolutely terrifying. I always find it really fascinating when things happen at night time and then people wake up in the morning and have a corresponding injury. And I do wonder if potentially it is your brain creating a scenario that can explain the pain in your arm. Do you know what I mean? Where you've got this pain in your arm in the night, but you don't wake up, so it kind of becomes incorporated into a dream or sleep paralysis episode. And also, please excuse my saying that this is a sleep paralysis episode, because it is much easier to assume this is a sleep paralysis episode than the alternative, which is that it wasn't a sleep paralysis episode, which is infinitely more terrifying. And story number 3 comes from Jacqueline. Let's just start out by saying that I'm an atheist. I'm 36 years old and I haven't prescribed to any particular faith since I was roughly 15. I think being raised in an interfaith marriage, my mom is a Baptist and my father is Jewish, probably contributed to this a great deal. I think it just put religion as a whole into a ridiculous perspective for me. However, for a person who doesn't believe, I've had far too many experiences that I simply cannot explain or justify. It would be disingenuous to say that these experiences haven't made me think more openly about not the existence of God necessarily, but the existence of souls or energies. The beginning of my experiences started in my early 20s. My mother, father and I moved into a home along with my aunt so that we could collectively care for my grandmother who had Alzheimer's. It was a great solution to the potentially and likely problem of burnout from being full-time caregivers. The house was a historical home, built pre-Civil War in Charleston in 1850. I had my first experience literally the first night I stayed there. My aunt had already moved her things in, and my family was still waiting on the arrival of our things from Colombia, roughly 1.5 hours away. My aunt and mom bunked together upstairs. The upstairs was fairly small. It had 2 bedrooms connected by one short hallway. There was just enough room in the hallway to place a couch. That's where I parked it for the night. Not long after I laid down, I began to hear 2 women whispering. I couldn't make out particular words, but I just heard an endless stream of hushed chatter. I immediately thought I was overhearing my aunt and mother talking. It seemed unlikely, being that it was 3 a.m, but it was the only logical explanation. I tried my best to drown out the whispers and I finally fell asleep. The next morning, I asked my mom what she and my aunt had been talking about all night. My mom was visibly confused. She informed me that they both went straight to sleep. I figured I must have misheard things. A few months after we had gotten settled in, my brother came to visit. Guess where he slept? And guess what he heard? I had not told anyone. I was stunned. Now, the house in general was creepy. The house was elevated and the garage was underneath. It spanned the entire space of the house. There were 2 non-functioning fireplaces on either side of the garage. Knowing that this house predates the Civil War in South Carolina, I don't really want to imagine why those were there. Odd things would routinely happen. Lights would turn on and off, things would move. We're talking about large things like dog gates. And simply hearing things were common occurrences. My best friend would never stay in my room alone. I will say that my room definitely had the most questionable vibes. It was always freezing. It was the only time in my life where I had required an electric blanket to sleep. The creepiest moment I experienced in that room was also the last time my best friend slept in that room. She noped it, and she noped it hard. We call it the BPI, or the baby powder incident. Just to remind you guys, I live in South Carolina, the muggiest of mugs. If you just walk outside during the summer, you will immediately have a beaded sweat moustache. So yes, a lady likes to stay dry. Tit sweat and swamp ass are not very becoming. Anyway, I had what was called a library bed. Both the headboard and footboard were thick, and you could use them as shelves. I would get ready and place my baby powder on the footboard. Once, when my best friend and I came upstairs, there was a trail of baby powder that was sprinkled on my side of the bed, from my pillow to the feet. There, the bottle of baby powder stood on the footboard, completely upright. It was reminiscent of a chalk outline. It felt ominous, and it certainly felt deliberate. We lived in that house for several more years until my grandmother passed away, and I cannot say there was a time that I ever felt at ease. It wasn't until my mid-30s when I had my next significant experience. I work as a nurse, and I have heard many nurses telling their eerie tales. I never had my own to share until a couple of years ago. I was in our supply room to get some meds. The room is a very large rectangle, and it has shelves all along the perimeter of the room except for the back wall, which has our Omnicell or medication dispenser. The centre of the room is completely empty, aside from larger supplies like IV poles and vital sign machines. I was at the back wall gathering my meds. I was completely alone. As I turned to leave, I jammed my shoulder into something solid. I immediately apologise, but then also realise I'm apologising to no one. I was still alone. I don't know what happened. To this day, it is something I think about nearly daily. There's just no way to explain it. Aside from paranormal experiences shared on your podcast, I've always found the stories of visitation dreams to be fascinating. I too have had a few visitation dreams. One dream was of the grandmother I mentioned previously. When she was here, she would always sit in this apricot-coloured leather chair. In the dream, I was aware she was gone, and I was standing behind the empty chair. The chair began to talk to me in her beautifully delicate voice. I will always hold that dream close to me. Another visitation dream I had proved to be fairly traumatic. Before I was a nurse, I was a caregiver to a Vietnam vet. He and I, although completely different in every way, we loved each other like family. He was in his 70s and I was in my 20s, but we had formed a true and deep friendship. Sadly, his wife was an absolute terror, and after 4 years, I finally quit. It was the right time anyway. I was deep in the throes of nursing school, and I needed my dedication and focus for that. Although I no longer worked for him, I would still pick him up and I would take him fishing or take him to the flea market. Like I said, we were very different. It was not my cup of tea, but I was happy to make him happy. One afternoon, I picked him up to go fishing. We stopped off at a convenience store to grab some bait, and he asked me if I could get him a beer. Although I was hesitant because he was an alcoholic, I had seen his wife allow him the occasional beer, and I thought it would be fine to nurse for a few hours at the lake. We fished, and afterwards on the way home, he asked if we could stop and grab a few more beers. His insistence made me uncomfortable, and I felt hurt that he would try to take advantage of me. When I finally dropped him off at home, I told myself I would give us a bit of space. He called me a week later, but I didn't answer. Life continued and it got away from me. That was in June of 2016. In February of 2017, I had 2 dreams about him, back-to-back nights. The first one wasn't significant, and I don't remember anything about it. The second dream was disconcerting. He called me and left me a voicemail from CVS, the pharmacy. It was like his message was one of those automated calls to let you know that your prescription was ready. In the message, he told me that he was gone, but he was okay. The next morning, I was retelling the dreams to my mother. I told her how weird it was to have 2 consecutive dreams about him. On a whim, I typed in his name along with the word obituary into the search bar. A picture I had seen so many times. One of him in his early 20s dressed in his army uniform, along with the hyphenated dates 1945 to 2017. I immediately dropped to my knees in inconsolable sobs. He had died in January of 2017, just the month before. His wife never called me to let me know that he passed away. I guess he just needed me to know. A couple of weeks later, I went to his grave to pay my respects. I am so grateful to him for so much. One being my career. I went to nursing school because of him. I'm grateful for his friendship, the recipes he passed to me, our long conversations, but I'm most grateful for him saying goodbye. And just to wrap up, I'd like to share a story my mother told me when I was younger. It is a story I can't seem to shake because of its strangeness. When my mother was a little girl, she spent the night at her next-door neighbour's, a woman she considered to be her grandmother. My mother tells me she doesn't feel like she made it through the night. She believes she died that night, and her whole life has been a figment of her imagination. She said it's such a strong feeling, weird and eerie. I guess the reason it's strange to me is because my mother is very rainbows and butterflies. It's just out of character. I think that house in South Carolina sounds absolutely terrifying, and I do think it's really interesting that the beginning of your experiences didn't happen until your early 20s. I know that you said, you're an atheist, you don't really believe in a God, etc., etc. And the fact that this didn't happen until your early 20s, to me, makes it really compelling, and especially when you were hearing those whispers of two women at night time. Of course, you're going to assume that it's your mum and your auntie. Like, of course you are. And then your brother heard the same thing afterwards. Those stories of people hearing like muffled conversations and muffled voices and the sounds of like a party or people laughing downstairs, that to me feels like stone tape theory, like the walls have absorbed that energy and kind of release it back every now and then. And as for the BPI, the baby powder incident, like that sounds like somebody took the baby powder and poured it the length of the bed and then put it back. That does feel deliberate. Like, that doesn't feel like an accident. That feels ominous. That feels deliberate. And in these stories, I always think of like, if you walked in the middle of that happening, are you just walking in and seeing the baby powder, the talcum powder floating in the air and spraying all down the bed and then floating itself back to its original resting place? And it for some reason, it always makes me giggle. And that story about you turning around and bumping into somebody, it's just giving me such heebie-jeebies because it's such a physical thing to happen. You know what I mean? It's a thing where you're like, you turn around and just jam your shoulder into something that isn't fucking physically there, that you can't see. That is honestly so terrifying, because your initial reaction is to go, oh Jesus, sorry, I didn't mean to walk into you, but there's nobody there. And I always think for a spirit, an entity, whatever it is, to take on that level of solidity is really terrifying. And I'm glad that the man that you were a caregiver for was able to come and say goodbye to you in whatever way that he could. Obviously that relationship was special, and a relationship doesn't have to be perfect to be special. I mean, clearly it was also a little bit fraught, and that's understandable. Working with people with addictions is difficult, and I'm just glad that he was able to find a way to come back and say to you, hey, I've passed on, but I just wanted to say goodbye. And the last part of your story is really strange. I don't quite know what to make of it. It is very strange and very eerie, but there are psychological reasons as to why somebody might think this, that they had died and not made it through the night. I believe one such psychological condition is called Cotard's syndrome, I think. Now, to be clear, that's not me diagnosing anybody with anything from afar. I'm just saying it is weird and eerie, but there are reasons as to why somebody may feel like this.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile.
With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Why don't more infant formula companies use organic, grass-fed whole milk instead of skim? Why don't more infant formula companies use the latest breast milk science? Why don't more infant formula companies run their own clinical trials? Why don't more infant formula companies use more of the proteins found in breast milk? Why don't more infant formula companies have their own factories instead of outsourcing their manufacturing? We wondered the same thing. So we made ByHeart, a better formula for formula. Learn more at byheart.com.
And our final story today comes from Anonymous. My story is a classic sleep paralysis story, but for me it was extremely frightening. So please, listeners, if you've never experienced sleep paralysis with additional experiences of terror, don't roll your eyes. To be honest, I wish people would stop disconnecting it from the paranormal, even though it has the physiological explanation. I think maybe it's triggered by energy in the moment or in the place. In my case, it has to be the place, because when I had the experience, I had no idea what was happening. I had never heard there was such a thing as sleep paralysis, and it's never happened to me again anywhere in the world, and this was nearly 30 years ago. I had the scariest night of my life in what, at the time, I didn't know was one of the most haunted houses in Australia. Whoopsie, bad choice of cheap accommodations. My mum and I were exploring a historical site in Tasmania, a state here in Australia that was a former penal colony. It's called Port Arthur. Tasmania, granted, has a very dark and sad past, but at that time of my life I wasn't as interested in the history of my country. So you could argue I was primed for the yuckiness of the history we saw that day as we walked around the site. All the jail cells and old buildings. But I felt kind of fine, and a bit bored by it, to be honest. It just all felt weird and old when I was that age. I was like, wow, old building, cool. So we spent the day in the valley and looked at all the courts and jails and old buildings and stuff, and it wasn't pleasant, but lots of our country's history is very dark. The site is kind of infamous for some super sad reasons I'm not going to give light to here, but lots of bad stuff has happened there. After we'd walked around all day and went on a boat ride, we went back to our brightly painted yellow hostel and made yummy dinner together in the cluttered communal kitchen. If you've ever stayed at a hostel, you know the vibe. Pamphlets for tours everywhere and mismatched kitchen appliances, weird stuff in the fridge. It didn't really have a spooky vibe at all, and since it was off season, we were the only ones there. So there was no creepy backpacker dudes to contend with like we had at other places. It was kind of a homely place downstairs, to be honest. It was painted sunny yellow. It just felt like a nice old house. We heard there was a ghost tour happening a few hundred metres away at the Port Arthur site, but we didn't believe in that stuff. We thought it was so silly, and we were staying a little bit away from where that was overlooking the site in our cosy historic hostel, so we weren't going out into the cold at night. It was super cold that night. Those ghost watchers were crazy, we thought. Cue the ominous music. We chilled out and made dinner and went to bed as we travelled on the next day. We stayed in a cute little old attic room. I loved it. I thought it was so cute, it was like something out of a storybook. It was at the front of the house overlooking the site. Since then I've googled it, and people do paranormal YouTubes in that very room these days. Little did I know. Some time before dawn, in the dark, I suddenly became conscious and opened my eyes, but I couldn't move. I tried to call out to my mum, but I couldn't speak. It was terrifying, and I didn't know what was happening. I could see her asleep on the other side of the room. Then I felt and sensed the most angry, evil presence was coming up the stairs that were right at the foot of my bed. I could almost feel their every step. I don't know how to describe why I knew it was a feminine presence, but it was. It was a very angry old woman. I didn't see her, but I felt her presence very, very clearly. She had a personality, almost like I knew her and she knew me. It sounds crazy, I know. The next sensation was that I was being pushed down into the bed. Through the bed into some dark place, sort of inside and under the bed. Yes, just like that scene in the movie Get Out. When I saw that movie, I freaked out because that was exactly what it was like, but it happened 30 years ago. It's like they took what happened to me and put it in a movie. It was so weird. The sensation which I was totally conscious for was as though I was being pushed down through the bed into a very dark place. I was absolutely terrified. Above me, up in the room, way up, there was a tiny dot of light where the room had been. I I thought I might be dying, that this was it. In my mind, I heard the saying from the Bible, if you have faith, even as small as a mustard seed, that's enough. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the idea. The spot of light was my tiny mustard seed of hope. I focused on that spot and eventually started to rise up. I've told this story before, but I usually don't tell the mustard seed bit because I'm worried the Bible verse will weird people out. It was there in my mind at the time, and I'm so grateful for that message. There was a time, I'm not sure how long, when I lay down there in the dark, not knowing what to do, thinking I was dead and stuck down in the nothing. It wasn't something I ever wanted to experience again. So when I rose up, I was so happy and grateful. Then I was back in my body, but I still couldn't move. I could move my eyes though, and I looked out the window above me and to the right, and it was the dimmest light of dawn. I was so relieved. It was dark when it started. I lay there for hours. I think it was about 2 hours, and I'm not even joking, because I heard the first bird call and nearly cried. I heard a crow in the morning and I thought, oh, it's going to be okay. I could eventually move, but there was no way I could try to sleep again. I just waited for Mum to wake up and pretended I was fine because I didn't know how to explain what had happened, and I felt embarrassed about how shaken I felt. For a long time I didn't know there was even a name for this, because it was early internet, and when I eventually, about 10 years ago, Googled and worked out what the house was called, I couldn't remember at the time, it's called the Parsonage. I found a video from the 90s of a guy being interviewed on television who was a tough kind of tradesman guy working on the restoration on the site, and he described the exact room and the same sleep paralysis experience. I couldn't believe it. I then learned about what it is and that it is universally known in every culture as being the old hag or the crushing ghost. There are several videos on YouTube now of the house and people doing ghost tours. They even go into the room where it happened because it isn't a hostel anymore. When they are doing their ghost hunter thing and they are saying, give us a sign, etc., I think, yeah, cool, do all that to your heart's content for your YouTube, but whatever you do, don't sleep there. If they slept there, they might not want to chase ghosts anymore. When people talk about wanting to see ghosts, I am very, very much no thanks, because I will never forget the palpable sense of anger and evil I felt that was coming for me that night. For all those who have experienced the scary version of sleep paralysis, just know that I get it. It can be a very, very scary experience. For those who haven't, I hope you don't, and I hope I never do again. I'm sorry for whoever was at the top of those stairs in real life in the past and felt her coming up the stairs and felt that fear. I hope they got away. Anonymous, I agree with you. There are so many people who kind of roll their eyes about sleep paralysis and they're like, oh, they're not real paranormal stories. And yes, and on the one hand, I agree. There are stories of sleep paralysis that are simply just sleep paralysis. However, I would implore anybody to watch the documentary The Nightmare. You can get it on YouTube as far as I'm aware. And it was a documentary that was made about sleep paralysis, and it scared the living bejesus out of me. And not because they sensationalize sleep paralysis, not because they're like, it's actually ghosts. They talk about the physiological impact and the physiological reasons for sleep paralysis, but they also have academics on who have studied the different cultures all around the world who all have the same experience of sleep paralysis. And I will ask time and time again, if we are all individual people with all our individual brains, all our individual fears and feelings, why are so many sleep paralysis stories about an old hag? It just scares the bejesus out of me. And sometimes I think there is something about energy in a particular place that maybe triggers sleep paralysis. There's something about the feelings of things that have happened there that, I don't know, send people into a sleep paralysis state. And I do think it's interesting that Anonymous experienced this sleep paralysis once, never again, and then found an interview with somebody else who also experienced the same sleep paralysis in that place. It's weird, man. It's weird. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Thank you to Carmelo, Jacqueline and Anonymous for sending in your stories. Remember, the last story came from May the 14th, 2024. And if you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Why don't more infant formula companies use organic, grass-fed whole milk instead of skim? Why don't more infant formula companies use the latest breast milk science? Why don't more infant formula companies run their own clinical trials? Why don't more infant formula companies use more of the proteins found in breast milk? Why don't more infant formula companies have their own factories instead of outsourcing their manufacturing? We wondered the same thing. So we made ByHeart, a better formula for formula. Learn more at byheart.com.